Oh, sorry. Can you guys see that slide now? Excellent. So thank you very much for letting me speak today. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my PhD work that I'm doing at the Centre for Applied Autism Research in Bath and with the Virtual Immersive Training and Learning Group in Exeter. I'm also going to touch on some work that's being done by Cineon, who are an immersive virtual reality training company that we've been lucky enough to work with alongside. And today I'm going to focus on this idea of using immersive virtual reality to help autistic people with certain daily living difficulties that they may have. And this was something that Matthew brought up yesterday, actually, as something that's quite important for virtual reality researchers to focus on. So I was really pleased when he said that. But today what I'm going to do is I'm sure most people listening today will know about the controversy and the balance surrounding whether research is being done to improve scientific understanding of autism, or whether it's actually being done to directly help autistic people in their day-to-day lives. The autism community are rightly very critical of a lot of research for maybe focusing too much on developing scientific understanding. Similarly, there's a lot of stuff that's being done at a practical level to help autistic people that doesn't necessarily have a great deal of evidence behind it. And today, what I'm hopefully going to persuade everyone or argue a case for is the idea that immersive virtual reality is a really nice tool for sort of bridging this gap between these two, what are often perceived as mutually exclusive domains. So to begin with, I'm going to focus on this aspect of how VR can help us improve our scientific understanding of autism by focusing on some of my PhD work. Now, my PhD is really interested in a particular aspect that determines daily living difficulties in autism, and those particularly relating to sensory and or motor difficulties, which is something that was just brought up in the last talk. So for those of you that maybe aren't aware of this point, most autistic people experience things like clumsiness or have difficulties coordinating their movements or integrating certain sensory information. Some autistic people also have difficulties learning some movement-related skills. And actually, this meta-analysis in 2010 put forward an argument that these sensory motor difficulties are potentially a core feature of autism. So they're really common, and we know that they're likely relating to things like the ability to perform certain daily living skills, the ability to be independent or have a high quality of life. Yet, very little is known about what causes these things and how we as practitioners can help the autism community negotiate some of these daily living difficulties. So my PhD has been using virtual reality to try and investigate and understand these sensory motor difficulties in a little bit more detail. In particular, we've integrated methodologies from neuroscience, computational psychology, and also elite sports science to develop a virtual reality protocol, a racquetball task where, as you can see in this video here, that's hopefully working all right for you guys, you can see participants hitting balls back towards a target whilst you track their hand movements, their eye movements, and their head movements. And you can hopefully see in this video that this ball is bouncing just like a sort of normal tennis ball would in the real world. And this is something that virtual reality allows us to do with a lot of precision. What we're able to do in sensory motor studies like this is we're able to control precisely the exact position, the exact trajectory, the exact features of the environment around participants in a way that we'd really struggle to do in a real world lab situation. Furthermore, what virtual reality allows us to do is it allows us to manipulate the environment in ways that never normally occur in the real world. So you can see here quite an amusing example of where a ball's bouncing with really unexpectedly high levels of bounciness. This ball has an elasticity profile that's even bouncier than those rubber bouncy ball toys that you used to get as a child. So what we're able to do here is create things that you'd never normally get in the real world that are quite unexpected for autistic people. And this allows us to examine a number of different hypotheses. For example, in our most recent study, we manipulated ball bounciness over time using sort of probabilistic structured environments so that you had a predictable and stable environmental condition and a volatile, unpredictably changeable task condition. And this allowed us to examine some key hypotheses surrounding autism and theories surrounding autism. It also allowed us to look at most daily living difficulties. It's relatively established that autistic people often struggle under more unpredictable or changeable task environments. And so what we're really excited to find is that actually, in terms of hand-eye coordination, if we look on the y-axis here, we have basically the proportion of balls that were successfully intercepted by participants. And what we can see generally, if we look at these grey bars, is they are slightly lower down than our neurotypical participants. But what's really striking here is that performance-related difficulties relating to sensory motor control were much more pronounced under the volatile task conditions. So this shows that, much like a number of other daily living difficulties, autistic people were maybe struggling under the more unstable or unpredictable environments, and that maybe practitioners should be trying to artificially induce stable or predictable task conditions. And that's something that I might focus on in just a minute. But from a scientific perspective, what virtual reality also allowed us to do was to examine a number of key theories, a number of key neurobiological mechanisms and networks that we know are involved in eye-hand coordination. So what we have on our y-axis on these graphs, for example, is the basically the height of gaze. So if you have a higher value here, this suggests you're looking higher up and closer to the ceiling. If you have a lower value here, this suggests you're looking lower down or closer to the floor. And firstly, what's really striking here, you can see, is that these curves, the pink curve for the autism group and the blue curve for our non-autistic participants, are really similar. They're doing very similar, they showed very similar eye-hand profiles over time, which already suggests that sensory motor difficulties are not necessarily due to any sort of broad cognitive or psychological differences in how participants were approaching the task. Furthermore, we found that the use of top-down information and the use of predictions was really similar between our participants. So both participants, for example, their eyes tended to skip ahead of the ball based on where they predict it's going to be in the future. And this allowed us to evaluate some key predictive processing theories and some key Bayesian frameworks that were talked about a little bit earlier in the session. Finally, what we also saw is that both groups were able to pursue the ball quite accurately towards the end as it came onto the racket. So this suggests that autistic people do have intact abilities to track fast-moving visual cues, at least in the context of this study. So what I've hopefully been able to demonstrate there is that a number of key psychological processes that have maybe been hypothesized to be different in autism, we were able to show that in the context of this study, these things are not necessarily impaired or different. We did also, however, highlight some subtle differences between the groups, which virtual reality and the sort of precise control that it gives us allowed us to look into. For example, we found that generally autistic participants show more restricted ranges of motion. We also, if we go back to this graph, found that around the time when the ball's bouncing, autistic participants tend to look a little bit higher up in a way that favors the more sort of bouncy balls. And we also found that autistic participants generally were less surprised when they were approached by these really unexpectedly bouncy balls. So what was really interesting here was that our neurotypical participants did show these exact behaviors, but only when they perceived the world around them to be quite unstable or volatile. So what this study and some of these virtual reality protocols have shown us is that actually, as I touched on a second ago, various neurobiological processes, networks and mechanisms do not necessarily appear to be impaired. And in particular, we've been able to evaluate some key theories of autism that have got a lot of traction and a lot of focus in recent years. We've also been able to see that much like many other daily living difficulties, difficulties in sensory motor performances are much more pronounced under the more unpredictable or more volatile task conditions. And finally, our most recent data that I just touched on there suggests that autistic people might be processing the world or interacting with the world like it's generally more uncertain or unstable. And this supports some really exciting work coming out of the labs of the University of Cambridge at the moment. So what I've hopefully been able to show you guys there is that, at least in the topic of sensory motor control and our understanding of these types of daily living difficulties, virtual realities allowed us to look at things and develop our understanding from a scientific perspective in ways that maybe haven't been done before. But what does this mean in terms of actually helping autistic people in their day-to-day lives? This is undeniably the most important factor of research, and this is something that we're trying to look into a lot as we approach the sort of final stages of my PhD. If I go back to this graph I showed you a second ago, and I briefly mentioned it at the time, what this data shows is that when environments are more stable, more predictable, autism-related performance difficulties are much smaller. So this lends itself to the question, can we make the world, like from an artificial perspective, can we make it more stable or predictable? Now, this isn't something that's really new, right? Most teachers, most practitioners who work with the autism community and autistic people themselves are generally very good at developing strategies or routines, maybe, that help make the world more predictable for an individual. But actually, if we go back to sensory motor control, what's clear is that a lot of movement related skills in particular are learned in very noisy, potentially overwhelming, and very unpredictable and unstable environments. And so instantly virtual reality does, and what we've seen in our labs is that virtual reality gives participants a chance to maybe perform these skills in a way that's more of a safe space for these individuals. Furthermore, though, what we're now looking into in the final year of my PhD is whether we can add predictive information or add cues that actually make the world more predictable for autistic people through the use of virtual reality. So we've been playing around with some Hawkeye cues here that can maybe do this in a way that you could never really do in the real world. But if we extend this sort of principle of making the world more predictable into more general daily living skills, there's a number of other really interesting areas that we can go into. One area of daily living difficulty that we're particularly focused on at the Centre for Applied Autism Research is that concerning employment. Many of you guys will be familiar with the pretty damning statistics that are on the screen there about employment in autism, which essentially highlight how many talented and skilled people the employers and the industries are missing out on at the moment. And one of the biggest barriers for this is the job interview. The job interview is a process that's used in pretty much all industries, but is a situation that's often very overwhelming for some autistic people, but that is also in its nature very uncertain and unstable. So Cineon Immersive Training and lots of other groups around the world at the moment are developing things like simulation tools. So this is a simulation tool that we've done at Cineon, which basically allows individuals to practice, to experience a job interview in virtual reality and to develop certain maybe coping strategies, certain skills, and ways in which they can deal with this quite uncertain and unfamiliar environment. Now this, as I say, isn't something that's just being done by Cineon. There's some more sort of traditional virtual, less sort of immersive, but more computer-based virtual interventions that have been developed in the US that have shown some really promising results for the autism community in this domain. Finally, we're also interested in the idea of healthcare here. The hospital is a very uncertain and potentially overwhelming situation for autistic people. And this paper, for those that haven't read it, is a really nicely summarizes actually some of the unique difficulties that some autistic people face in these settings, particularly those that have maybe sensory hypersensitivities or things relating to anxiety. And actually, I also wanted to plug at this point some work that's been done by the Centre for Applied Autism Research, where they've been trying to work with how we can adjust how professionals are interacting at social level with autistic people as well in these settings. But this idea of making the world more predictable is really potentially useful in this area from an evidence-based perspective. Cineon have been working not just with autistic people, but with more general populations who are maybe anxious or maybe uncertain about going in for MRI scans. What virtual reality allows us to do here is you can put on a virtual reality headset in a safe space or familiar environment and practice, develop strategies, or maybe get familiar with some of these quite noisy, potentially overwhelming sensory stimuli that you might receive in an MRI scan. And we're now hoping to snowball this work, and we're really excited to be working with some individuals in the NHS about how we can develop some autism-specific interventions that might be related to this stuff. So how we can maybe help autistic people with more routine day case operations, or things like sitting in a waiting room, or communicating with healthcare professionals. So hopefully what I've been able to do there in the last 10 minutes or so is provide an argument that actually immersive virtual reality can really bridge this gap between developing our scientific understanding of autism and helping autistic people manage daily living difficulties. What virtual reality does and the unique control it gives us over an environment obviously has a number of benefits from a scientific perspective, but also it can really be used to potentially help autistic people if it's used in an evidence-based way. And this is something that we're hoping to do now in our work in the future. And also, if we go back to some of the stuff that was focused on yesterday, particularly in Matthew's talk, if we're doing this from a more critical perspective and evidence-based perspective, there's some real promise potentially in this field. So I'd like to acknowledge all the people who have helped me with this research. I'd also just like to plug some of the groups that I was talking about there, because a lot of the work was done as part of groups rather than being led by me. So we've got the Centre for Applied Autism Research, the Virtual Immersive Training and Learning Group, and also Cineon. And I've got some of their websites there, and I believe some of their websites are also on the AVRA website under my name. But thank you very much for listening, and I'll now open up the floor for questions.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was an excellent talk. Thank you. We've got one question from Tammy.
Yes, I just wanted to ask you, did you find that the groups got better with practice with the bouncy ball task? And I was just wondering how you controlled for that.
So at the moment, that's a really good question. And that's certainly the way that we need to develop this research in the future. At the moment, we haven't really looked at the learning aspects of this in too much detail. We are really interested in why autistic people have sensory-motor difficulties, so that we can maybe develop more optimal virtual reality procedures. The idea of introducing bouncy balls wasn't necessarily done to, at this stage, to enhance motor learning. It's something that we're now looking forward to in the future, looking at ways in which we can maybe do this and maybe do some virtual reality. So participants only completed sort of 45 trials in each condition, and that wouldn't have really been enough to be able to look at motor learning differences in a great deal of detail. But some of the research that's being done, particularly down here in Exeter, is looking at motor learning and different ways in which we can do this in virtual reality at the moment. So that's really exciting.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we've also got Sophie, who's got her hand up. If you'd like to ask your question, Sophie.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I can't seem to activate my camera, but thank you very much, Tom. It was a really exciting, interesting talk. I wondered, this might be a silly question, but I wondered if in your graphs where you showed the stable and the volatile experiment, it seemed like you had some maybe ceiling effects in some of those participants. I wonder if you've done anything else, or you have a perspective of how the difficulty of the task might interact with that stable and volatile phases, because yeah, I guess some of your participants, you didn't have the capacity maybe to see if the stable volatile condition affected their performance.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. Yeah, that's a really valid point. This task, so as I talked about, this variable is actually not a particularly sensitive one. This is just simply the proportion of balls that were successfully intercepted. Now, so simply it's whether they hit the ball with the racket. Now, as you can see, and you've rightly pointed out here with ceiling effects, there's a lot of participants in both groups who are actually hitting every single ball. We started to explore the idea of looking at whether the balls were successfully hitting the target. The issues we have with this is a lot of that's going to be determined by the accuracy of the virtual reality sort of interactions with the racket. We were only tracking hand position and head position, and to be able to get really accurate perceptions of things like how hard people are hitting it, we'd need to look at like the elbow joint and some of those other things as well, which is doable, but it's something that we hadn't done at that point and is a lot more complicated in VR. But we did find it still interesting, just to go back to these, we did still find it interesting that if we're simply looking at how often participants hit the ball, you still see quite a lot of variance, particularly in the autism group. And the variance is something that we see in a lot of sensory motor control studies. and is really anecdotally reported as well, in the sense that a lot of autistic people have movement related difficulties, but there's also a lot of autistic people who are absolutely enjoy playing sport and have no issues relating to sensory motor control that they can detect at all. So we use this data really to show that what is not really a very sensitive measure is still sort of able to highlight some of these potential differences. Does that answer the question? Right.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. Yeah, super interesting. And I think it is a brilliant starting point. So look forward to seeing where you go next with it. Thanks.
Thank you, Sophie.
Okay, next I think Yuki has a question for you, Tom.
Thank you very much for very interesting talks. I actually also have the questions to the same point. And not only from your study, but also there are many other studies looking at comparing the TD and the ASD, that we always see there are huge varieties and variances in the ASD groups. And then from the computational, the modeling studies, we started hypothesizing that not only the hypoplier, weak plier, but also the hyperplier may account for the different types of ASD. We know that the persons with ASD sometimes show the superior abilities compared to the TD, or sometimes they show their weak abilities. So do you think that there are not only one type of the ASD, like weak plier, but also the different types of the ASDs can be also included in your experiment?
Thank you. That's another really good question. That's something we're definitely very interested in. There's obviously the possibility here, as I've just talked about, the variability. Lots of autistic people are different, right? And autistic people have different challenges and difficulties in some of these things. And it'd be very interesting to see if that is reflected at a computational level or a neurobiological measure level, as you were just talking about. We also found, one thing we found that was really interesting from the perspective that you were just talking about was also the association between some of these measures and some of these sort of volatility related measures that I talk about here. So we did find, for example, range of motion is commonly associated with sporting expertise and with levels of motor performance as well. The variability in this measure was a little bit smaller. So most autistic people did tend to interact with a restricted range of motion. But what was quite interesting is that our measures in particular of sort of behavioral surprise were really strongly correlated with the overall levels of difficulty that participants faced in this task. Now, to bring it back to some of these computational hypotheses, one, I focused on this idea of Rebecca Lawson and some of the research being done in Cambridge. The stuff that you talked about how some individuals might have hypopriors and some individuals might have hyperpriors fits in quite nicely with some of her hypotheses, from my understanding, because we did see if we were taking the hyperpriors hypothesis quite literally, we'd expect that autistic people have difficulties predicting where the ball's going to bounce because their prior expectations are attenuated. But what we actually found is that autistic participants tended to, just like neurotypical participants, their eyes tended to move ahead of the ball based on where they predict it's going to be. And as you saw in some of the graphs I presented, they tended to move in similar positions and at similar time points. But what could be being done here is if autistic people are perceiving the world around them or processing the world around them like it's more unstable, this means that predictions will be updated at a much quicker rate. Under volatile conditions, if you think the world around you is changing, you obviously update your prior expectations, and this could cause you to be more reliant on certain expectations in some conditions and other expectations in others. And it fits really nicely with the variability that we see, because that suggests that that you'd expect to see differences between participants because it's all being driven by their experiences in the world and their expectations of volatility.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I really like your experimental design.
It's a good fun study to participate in as well. So it's been the easiest one to recruit that I've ever done.
Okay, and David also has a question for you, Tom.
Hi, Tom. Thank you. Yeah, really interesting to see how that's developed since the last time we heard about it. I think I want to ask something about the virtual reality interview practice and the sort of new directions you're going in. And obviously, I'm not asking you to do an advert for Cineon necessarily, but what is, you know, people have been doing this sort of work for a long time. Is it just the same? What's the unique selling point of, oh, I'm sounding like a Dragon's Den or something here, right? But what's the USP of the way that you're doing it compared to the way that, you know, has been done over the last sort of 5 to 10 years?
So firstly, one thing I will just start with a disclaimer is I think Cineon are quite keen to not necessarily to make it really unique and go in a new way, because sort of what I touched on briefly as well as the idea that actually teachers and carers and people that work with autistic people and autistic people themselves have been trying to do this sort of thing for years, trying to make the world more predictable. And science may be catching up in this way, in the sense that I framed it as maybe making the world more predictable, or maybe developing these strategies. But that's something that isn't necessarily that unique. What virtual reality does allow you to do, by in particular simulations like I showed you here, this was actually only a 360 video that was developed, but these sort of things can be rendered now into your full head-mounted displays. And the level of immersion, the realism of some of the sensory aspects and your experiences of the environment around you, by increasing the fidelity of some of these things, you're going to be able to do this stuff in a way that hasn't really been done before. And as I showed in some of my other stuff as well, with the with these Hawkeye cues or stuff, you can add stuff into virtual reality. You can add cues, for example, into these sort of, you can give real-time feedback. You can really individualize the training. And some of the stuff we're looking at working with the NHS as well is really about individualizing the experience for the autistic person's needs. And actually a lot of these, I was quite careful with how I presented these, because a lot of these are not just being developed for autistic people. In particular, the MRI simulation that I showed you guys is actually being produced in general. Lots of people in the world don't like MRI scans or are nervous about MRI scans, and that's something that I think is often lost. People often assume that autistic people have very unique needs, or very unique, but these are things that are sometimes quite common and that are going to benefit lots of people. And that if you can work with autistic people and gain the experience, gain understanding of working with autistic people, then these sort of things, I'd imagine, will be much more successful.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks,
you stole it to me.
I think we've got time for one more question. I've got a question from Lee here. The question is, are Cineon taking back their findings to corporations, other universities, etc., to also implement autistic-friendly interviews or accessible interviewing techniques too, so that the interview is accessible in the first instance, and then the VR is a grounding / calming tool to neurodivergent people?
Yeah, that's another great question. So Cineon work closely with the virtual immersive training and learning group in Exeter. So one of the unique selling points that Cineon use is the idea that everything is developed from an evidence-based perspective, which, as has been talked about a lot in the last couple of days, is something that a lot of virtual reality training interventions maybe don't do so well. Everything has to be evidence-driven for them. And so this is something that that's something that the data is almost being done before we develop the simulations themselves. What we're then looking to do, and what Cineon are trying to do more and more, is working also with the university. So once they've developed these products, we can then test them and modify them and develop them in the future. Now, this is something that we're definitely looking to do. It's something that's a work in progress. Cineon are a relatively new company that are expanding. And there's lots of other companies out there. It doesn't just have to be an advert for Cineon, but obviously I'm pretty passionate because I've been working with these guys recently. But we can develop, if we can then test, we can go back to Cineon and they can develop their product, but also we can improve our understanding and our ability to share some of this knowledge and help other companies as well. And it's also worth pointing out, just as a final plug, that a lot of the stuff that Cineon are producing, things like that virtual reality simulation, is available on YouTube and can just be played in a Google Play device. So this is something that is also quite accessible for a lot of people, which is obviously very important if we're looking at developing things that can help autistic people.
Thank you, Tom. Does anyone else have any burning questions before we wrap up for the day? No? Okay. Yes, so Shimona's just put up a thing on the chat about the Twitter, just to remind you all that that we now have a YouTube channel available, so all the recordings will be available there. Thanks again to all the speakers who have attended today. That was a fantastic day again. And tomorrow we'll have another day, which is our last day of AVRA, beginning at, I think, 1 p.m. Is that